Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today for our discussion. I'm really looking forward to the nature of the discussion that we're going to have today. Of course, like all of our EDI sessions, there will be some housekeeping that I need to speak to you about before we get started, especially on a topic as sensitive as today. If you are not muted, please feel free to mute your speaker. So today's session is going to be on embracing minds, building a neuro-inclusive public service. As you are aware, my name is Ramona Kyabaggu, and I am an assistant professor here at JSGS here in Regina. I am pleased to welcome you here today as the moderator. So Johnson Shammer Graduate School of Public Policy, or JSGS for short, is a national hub for advanced study and research in public policy administration. We are a partnership between the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan that was based on the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that defines Saskatchewan. Since our inception in 2007, we have swiftly become one of Canada's leading policy schools for educating graduate students and public servants interested in and devoted to advancing public value. At this time, I would like to acknowledge that while today's event is taking place online, JSGS's physical homes are located on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Pseudo-Ru, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the traditional homeland of the Métis. And certainly if you're in another jurisdiction across Canada, please feel free to add, where you're from, which treaty you're from, and location. We'd love to know that. We are glad to welcome those of you joining us today from across Turtle Island and make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside in or we might be visiting. I, of course, encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the land you reside on. Think about and express gratitude in your own way for the place and for the people who have safeguarded it throughout time. If you feel comfortable, like I mentioned before, you're welcome to share your land acknowledgement. We would really appreciate that through the chat. And as you do, please think about the actions we can identify to actively engage in reconciliation to honor the land and its people. So for those of you new to our EDI discussion series, I am pleased to welcome you today. This is your first time. I hope it won't be your last. This series focuses on engaging current and future public servants on issues pertaining to equity, diversity, and inclusion in the public sector, of course. This series is proudly supported by the Max Bell Foundation, who encourage the development of forward-looking innovations that impact public policies and practices. If you'd like to know more information on the Max Bell Foundation and their work, please click on the link in the chat. So Karen will provide that for you. So today's discussion, like I mentioned, is going to focus on neurodiversity in the public sector. Our speakers will be sharing information on topics that may trigger or re-stimulate trauma to those attending today's event. So we do recognize the need for safety measures here to minimize the risk associated with that triggering. So if you're experiencing any distress as a result of this presentation, please also look to the Zoom chat for a list of resources that you can certainly access. And as I mentioned earlier, to help our event run smoothly, we ask that all attendees stay muted and turn off their video during the first part of our event. Feel free to turn your videos back on for the Q&A. We definitely want to hear your questions. We have great questions prepared, but we also want to hear from you in regards to your questions. So for today's format, we're going to start with speaker introductions, which I'll do shortly. Our speakers will provide some background on their own experiences, touching on some of the broader issues that will be relevant for today's discussion. After that, we'll dig a bit deeper into the moderated Q&A, where I'll pose some questions to our panelists to get us started. But this would be a great time for you to start putting your questions in the chat. So, this will give you, like I mentioned, time to come up with questions for today's speakers. And following this, we'll open up to the audience Q&A. The more questions, the faster we'll get to the audience Q&A. So feel free to put those in. If you would like to ask questions, please use the Zoom's chat function to send your question to Karen, or you can send it to myself if you'd like, and I will pose your question to our panelists. Feel free to submit questions at any time during today's event. If you have any logistic questions during today's event, please don't hesitate to send a message to Karen via Zoom's chat, or email her at jsgs.events@uregina.ca. You'll be able to find Karen's contact information in the chat. So please also note that as with all of our EDI presentations, this presentation is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the JSGS website at a later time. So keep that in mind also as you're posing your questions. If it's a sensitive question, you'd like to ask the question anonymously, just let us know and we'd be happy to do that for you, okay? Before we get into today's discussion, I would like to disclose that I am myself neurodivergent, and so I'm particularly excited about today's presentation. A lot of the questions were not only reflective of things I'm seeing in regards to social movements today in Canada, the things that I encounter as I teach students. We're at a public policy school, but also my own personal and professional experiences. And I hope that we're able to generalize that to many of you who are working in knowledge sectors today. So let's get started. So now that the logistics are out of the way, I'm pleased to introduce you to your speakers. First, we have Greg Lindsmeyer. He's Director, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion of the Public Service Commission of the Government of Saskatchewan. Greg is an accomplished leader with over 13 years of service as a naval officer in the Royal Canadian Navy and is proudly Métis. Currently, he serves as the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, as I said, as the Saskatchewan Public Service Commission, where he brings a wealth of experience driving organizational change. Greg is known for combining strategic acumen with deep-seated commitment to advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. Next, we have Brandon Newton, registered psychologist with the Learning Disabilities Association of Saskatchewan. Brandon Newton is a registered psychologist who is currently employed as the Director of Service Delivery for the Learning Disabilities Association of Saskatchewan. He has worked in several school divisions as a classroom teacher and school psychologist, and was most recently the coordinator of student services for the Greater Saskatoon Catholic School Division, overseeing intensive programming and mental health supports. He is also working towards his PhD in educational administration at the University of Saskatchewan, focusing on the impact of class size and class composition on teachers. So over the last 5 years, we have Deandra Nicholson, who has been working at the Autism Resource Center as an inclusive employment consultant. Nearly a decade ago, while completing her Bachelor of Human Justice degree, she began working hands-on with people with disabilities and fell in love with her work. Since working at ARC, and getting to know many neurodivergent adults, she noticed similarities between herself and the job seekers she was supporting. She began exploring her own neurodiversity, and just a few years ago, she got an ADHD diagnosis that has transformed her work and life. So now she has the privilege of educating employers about neurodiversity from both professional and personal perspectives. With many family members who are autistic and or have ADHD, she advocates for celebrating neurodiversity and creating inclusive workplaces. In addition, we have Alberto Ortez Rosilio, Senior Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Consultant, Public Service Commission, Government of Saskatchewan as well. He's a dynamic professional with a background in public administration and passion for community and inclusion. Alberto embarked on his Canadian journey in 2009, settling in Regina from Mexico. Very exciting. His academic pursuits at the University of Regina culminated in degrees in political science and an MPA from our very own JSGS. His career has spanned roles from the City of Regina to impactful work with the Regina Open Doors Society, leading to a fulfilling first role in EDI with FCC. Currently, he is a Government Saskatchewan Senior EDI Consultant. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Christine van der Meer, ADHD coach, PCAC, and academic strategist with the Learning Disabilities Association of Saskatchewan. Christine is a dedicated ADHD coach with the Learning Disabilities Association of Saskatchewan. She's an accomplished professional with a passion for helping individuals harness their unique strengths while navigating the challenges associated with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Armed with a BA in psychology, Christine has honed her expertise in understanding complex facets of human behavior and mental well-being. Her commitment to making a meaningful impact led her to pursue international certification as an ADHD coach through the esteemed Professional Association of ADHD Coaches. This certification attests to her comprehensive understanding of ADHD and equips her with the tools necessary to guide individuals towards a more fulfilling life. Christine's coaching approach is rooted in empathy and a deep appreciation for neurodiversity. She recognizes that each individual's journey with ADHD is unique, and her goal is to empower her clients to leverage their strengths, overcome challenges, and thrive in their personal and professional pursuits. Her coaching journey solidified her belief in the transformative power of understanding, compassion, and tailored guidance in the pursuit of holistic well-being. And I can personally attest to Christine's empathy and her, expertise. As she was my ADHD coach. So I'm really happy to have her here today as well in a different capacity. So welcome to our panelists. So I'm pleased, we're going to sort of start out with a few short presentations, and then we'll get into the moderated discussion. So I'm pleased to turn over the floor to Brandon and Christine, who will start us off. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Great. And do you have slides to pull up? Feel free to pull them up if you do.
Oh, I'm just going to talk.
Okay, great.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Ramona. As Ramona had indicated, I am a registered psychologist. I was a teacher a long time ago as well. I'm currently the Director of Service Delivery for the Learning Disabilities Association of Saskatchewan, so I oversee all the programs and services there. The Learning Disabilities Association of Saskatchewan, for those of you who do not know, it's a not-for-profit organization. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary last year. We have offices in Saskatoon, Regina, and Prince Albert, and we primarily serve individuals with learning disabilities and ADHD and some of the related concerns. The programs that we currently have at LDAS, we do psychoeducational assessments. We do psychoeducational assessments for individuals with a variety of concerns, and we see children, adolescents, and adults. We have an ADHD coaching department, which is where Christine works, and I'll let her talk a little bit more about that. We do tutoring. We have adult education classrooms and a children's classroom as well. So I'll just start a little bit by talking a bit about what learning disabilities and ADHD are, and then get into the concept of neurodiversity just a little bit before I hand it over to Christine. So learning disabilities can be defined as a neurodevelopmental disorder that affect the ability to efficiently learn specific types of information. Now, when I say a neurodevelopmental disorder, that means it's brain-based, and it is something that begins in the developmental period. So typically we're talking about during childhood. When I talk about the specific types of information that are problematic for people with learning disabilities, I'm referring to reading, writing, math. We don't generally diagnose somebody with a learning disability in, say, science or social studies. It's for the most part just the reading, writing, and math that are addressed by that diagnosis. Learning disabilities are caused by weaknesses in some of the cognitive processes that assist in the acquisition of academic skills. So when I say the cognitive processes, there are aspects of cognition or our intellectual functioning that have a significant impact on, say, the ability to learn to read. And so learning disabilities by definition are caused by a weakness in one of those cognitive processes, sometimes more. Learning disabilities are not caused by a global intellectual impairment. In fact, the diagnosis itself depends on normal functioning, although that can be defined in many different ways. But it's different than an intellectual disability. And it's not caused by a lack of educational opportunities or other psychosocial factors such as stress and anxiety or challenging environment at home. And so those are the types of things we need to rule out when we're looking at a diagnosis of learning disability. ADHD is also a neurodevelopmental disorder. It's centered around two clusters of symptoms. So there are inattentive symptoms and there are hyperactive and impulsive symptoms. So there's a few different types of ADHD that can be diagnosed. We've got ADHD predominantly the inattentive presentation, where most of the symptoms fall under that category. And we've got ADHD predominantly hyperactive and impulsive presentation, where most of the symptoms fall under that category. And then we've got a combined presentation as well. But what's important about understanding ADHD is really at the heart of ADHD are deficits in impulse control and something we refer to as executive functioning. So I'm sure some people are familiar with that term. It's a very complicated construct that could take an entire session to explain, but it's a set of skills and abilities that basically help us to produce and help us to get things done. So the executive functions, there's a whole series of them, but some of the common ones that people often struggle with are things like planning, organization, time management. So the concept of neurodiversity, and I think that's where a lot of this presentation is headed, is talking about this concept. The idea originated sometime in the 1990s, and it's the idea that neurological differences represent natural variations in the human population, just like many other characteristics would. And that these variations should be accepted rather than pathologized, and that there should be a recognition that neurodivergent individuals have strengths and abilities that can be used to contribute in any environment. So with that, I'll hand it over to Christine, and she can talk a little bit more about her role at LDAS.
Not able to do that? Okay. Yes, so I am an ADHD coach. Generally, I meet with my clients one-on-one, either in person or online, and sometimes as well with family members or others that they might want to invite to this session. Our sessions generally last anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour, and coaching can stretch over sessions going on to 10 sessions, maybe sometimes 4 or 5. And sometimes people do come back to me after a couple of years, say they just want to touch base. They've managed their skills, they've applied all kinds of strengths, but they just want to touch in and make sure that they are still comfortable. So as an LDAS coach, I am one of a group of 9 very accomplished ADHD coaches, and we do confer with each other. We are also very much supported by the rest of the team, the psychologist, as well as all of the other staff with LDAS as well. So what I do in a coaching session, first of all, my job is to create a safe and non-judgmental space where we can explore strengths and also challenges. And then we progress onto identifying goals and to prioritize those goals and barriers and to find ways to reach goals and to apply strategies. When I talk about strategies, I'm sure most everybody here has seen TikTok videos or read books or has been online somewhere and come across these strategies. These are wonderful. But remember that each and every one of these strategies frequently and almost always need to be tweaked and tailor-fitted to the person, their strengths and their passions. So frequently at the end of even the very first session as an ADHD coach with a new client, I will hear them say that it is the very first time in their lives that they are meeting with somebody who actually really understands their challenges and joys and strengths. And whereas presumably then as a coach, I should feel good about this because I've done my job and I've made my client feel comfortable. I also find that incredibly tragic, especially I'm thinking of a 70-year-old client who just retired from an extremely successful career, which has left them with severe mental health challenges and impacts, and who may sit through my entire first session crying because of the struggles they still face. So Ramona, I'm incredibly, incredibly grateful for what you're doing in raising awareness. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. So we can now move over to Deandra.
There we go. Can everyone see my screen? Okay. Sorry, I have a frog in my throat all of a sudden. All right, thanks for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm really excited to be here. I saw the list of people who were joining us, and I'm really honored to be speaking here about neurodiversity to all of you. So I'm joining you from Treaty 4 territory in Regina. My name is Deandra Nicholson. I use she, her pronouns. As Ramona said, I've been at the Autism Resource Center in our employment program for almost 5.5 years. I actually went for my assessment at LDAS, where my colleagues are from here, and got my diagnosis at the age of 28. And interestingly enough, Christine was my ADHD coach as well, and she is so fantastic. Yeah, she's a phenomenal human being. So yeah, thanks for having me here. I'm excited. I work at the Autism Resource Center. We're a nonprofit organization in Regina. We serve autistic adults, typically between the ages of 18 to 35 years. We also have a summer therapeutic camp program for children as well, but we predominantly support adults. And some of the program areas that we offer support in is around life skills. So that could be like learning about your sensory profiles, or learning how to live independently, or learning about healthy relationships and sexuality. We also have a mental health group or a mental health program where we have groups and one-on-one sessions with our members. And then we also have our employment program, which I'll talk about in a minute here. I guess our team is small, but we are mighty, and we're kind of overworked and underfunded, I would say. So we're doing our best to meet the demands. And over the past, even just 5 years since I've been here, the demand has grown substantially for our support. One of the negative things, I guess, is that we require a diagnosis, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but it's pretty hard to get as an adult. So we are working on that. Okay, so this is just a bit of a visual to explain the employment journey and some of the supports that we offer along that journey. So we could start working with someone who's like fresh out of high school, doesn't really have a lot of experience or have an idea of what they want to do in life. Then we would kind of start over here in the pre-employment discovery stage and work all the way through until they're employed. Or we also have many members who are highly educated, have lots of experience, and just need some help with maybe navigating an interview, because those are really hard. By utilizing our state-of-the-art innovations too, we can kind of help people discover what they're interested in and build their skills. Yeah, then we go through, the rest of the steps, the resume, cover letter, applications, interview prep. once the member gets hired, we actually provide on-site job coaching. So that can help not only the member have like a bit of almost like a source of support or comfort there with them, but we also help the employer. So things that we can do is like help translate, basically. It's said that between autistic and non-autistic people, it's almost like two different operating systems trying to communicate. It works, but sometimes it doesn't work too well. So we serve as like a bit of a translator. We also serve as a bit of an educator as well, to not only help our member fit into the workplace, but help the workplace accept a neurodivergent person. And so a way that we do that is through presentations. So ARC has fully developed a 3-part series of presentations focusing on neurodiversity in the workplace. There are 3 different potential topics that we focus on. So hiring, ND means neurodivergent, hiring neurodivergent employees, leading neurodivergent employees, or working with neurodivergent employees. So this could be either a 3-part series where we kind of have back-to-back sessions for different audiences, or we can choose just individual presentations, or do it as a combination of all 3. And in those presentations, we talk about something I'm very passionate about, universal design, which I hope we'll have a chance to talk about later. And lastly, this is just a very small snapshot of the inclusive champions, or the employers that we work with in our organization. We actually have, I think, quite a few here from the public service, which is really nice to have them here supporting us. Special shout out to SaskTel, City of Regina, and the Ministry of Highways. You know who you are. And we're always looking for new employers to partner up with. So if you are interested in gaining access to like an untapped market of really skilled candidates, yeah, feel free to reach out to me. I'd love that. All right, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Deandra. And I saw virtual reality. You know, my background's in informatics. So you and I need to have a conversation. We've done some work around cultural humility, and maybe there's some connections. Very exciting and innovative.
Yeah, we
go
just
ahead.
got this new software, and it is amazing what you can do with virtual reality. I would love that.
Excellent. We'll follow up. Thank you. So now moving on to Alberto.
I'm just going to do a quick intro before Alberto jumps in. So thanks, Ramona. I want to just acknowledge all the other panelists that we have here today, a great group of experts in this field. So Alberta and I are here representing the Government of Saskatchewan Public Service. Our unit is our Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Unit, working out of the Public Service Commission, which is the central human resources commission within the GOS. So we work in collaboration, not like Alberta and I, we work in collaboration with the many other excellent branches within the government, or within the Public Service Commission, to try to work towards creating a diverse and inclusive workplace. So that's one of our goals within our business plan each year, is to create a representative workforce that reflects the citizens that we serve. And that includes neurodiverse individuals. Alberta will get more into how we approach some of this, but we do try to encourage help managers creating tools and whatnot to support neurodiverse individuals in the workforce. So I'm going to turn it over to Alberto, who's going to jump into some of the information that we have within our GOS, and explore a bit more what we have across Canada as well when it comes to public service supporting neurodiverse individuals. So over to you, Alberto.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Ramona, and thanks to all the panelists, everybody who joined us today. I'm very excited to be here as well. As mentioned, my name is Alberto Ortiz, and I'm a Senior Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Consultant with the Public Service Commission. We call it the PSC, so when we hear me say PSC, that's what it is. And with the Government of Saskatchewan, GOS, Greg mentioned it, right? It's we're very used to our acronyms. I've only been in this role for 3 months, but I have actually been working in EDI for over 4 years, like Ramona mentioned in the introduction. And I have been working with vulnerable populations since I graduated from Johnson Shoyama almost 9 years ago. So time really flies. So I only have a few minutes here, and I want to talk a little bit about the policy environment where neurodiversity fits in government today, right? If I speak quickly enough, I may share a few examples, but I know we have the Q&A, so I may save all the examples for then. So quickly, policy environment. So what do we have? Employment equity work, like Greg said, it's the basis for some of the work that we can do in the government to advocate for varied inclusion of neurodiverse experiences across the public sector. I have to say that there's currently no national or provincial legislation that explicitly identifies neurodiverse individuals as an equity-deserving group. However, that doesn't mean that we don't have tools that we can use to promote the inclusion for individuals. The first tool that I can talk about is the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission. They are the ones that give us the definitions for equity groups in the GOS. They talk about disability in a broad sense. That gives us a tool to consider neurodiversity in that group. I understand that there's debate whether neurodiversity is a disability or not. However, I know that both communities have been going hand in hand, right, to look for better inclusion overall. Next is the very recently published or passed Saskatchewan Accessibility Act. Only last year it was passed. We're only working on our first accessibility plans, right? But what I really like about the act, and it mirrors the federal act as well, is that it focuses on removing barriers. Right? So an individual only experiences a disability when they encounter a barrier. And we know that when we remove one barrier for an individual or a group of individuals, we're removing them for everybody, right? So the perfect example, the most common use is the ramp. So you put a ramp and an individual is able to use it whether they're in a wheelchair or not, right? So you're removing a barrier that everybody doesn't have to deal with anymore. After that, we have our our equity, diversity, and inclusion policy. It's currently under review. We're very, very close to having it approved. And we use the language from the Accessibility Act, which is very helpful because then we have better tools to promote inclusion of all individuals, including neurodiverse individuals, of course. Last but not least, we have another very important tool in the GOS, and it's our duty to accommodate. Our duty to accommodate applies to all aspects of employment. That's recruitment and selection, working conditions and performance of job duties, learning and development, right? And work-related social activities. Very, very important that everybody feels like they belong in all areas of work. When we apply this duty to accommodate, we know that we also have to make an effort to recruit more neurodiverse individuals. The PSC provides support to leaders and employees across GOS when these accommodation requests are put forward, right? We have a manual that leaders get that even references neurodiversity as a basis for accommodation. That's very, very helpful when managers are learning about it. Because one of the most important pieces, I think, is that there's still a lot of stigma around these, right? So first step is to have managers be comfortable with having the conversations. And that's why I know our accommodation teams are really, really good at advocating for neurodiverse individuals. Last but not least is the equity and inclusion team, right? So like Greg mentioned, the GOS has an inclusion strategy. It's supported by an annual inclusion action plan, and it has specific goals that for all ministries and the PSC, right, that we need to deliver on. The equity, diversity, and inclusion team has a very important role creating a safe space, a brave space where every individual and every team member is comfortable sharing their lived experience, right? Which is very important in this case. I'm going to leave it at that for the introductions because I know we're going to have much more time to chat with through the questions and answers.
Excellent. Thank you, Greg and Alberto. That was really insightful. And I'm seeing some of your colleagues getting excited about the work that you're doing. So we'll have a great discussion about that work. So we're going to now move into the moderated questions, but I'm already seeing some wonderful questions coming through. I may integrate them somewhat into the moderated questions, but please continue to send those questions through. I'm keeping track of them and we will get to them, okay? Okay, so I'm going to start with a question that I'd like to direct to Brandon. And it does somewhat relate to Lily's question, so I may follow up with Lily's question. If you can handle a loaded question here, I think you can. So the question is, in knowledge-based work environments, like those in the public sector, what specific challenges do neurodivergent employees face? And, you know, I just wanted to mention this idea that Lily Dyke brought up about challenges as it might relate to energy levels. So could you also incorporate in your response the challenge of that energy level for neurodivergent individuals? Thank you, Brandon.
Sure, no problem. Thanks for the question. I'll try to address that first. I'm not sure if I can give you a solid answer. I could give you some speculation. So, and what I would start with is by saying that having challenges associated with some of the diagnoses that we'll be talking about today, that in itself could wind up being draining for people because there's challenges other people don't face. So, you know, if we take something like ADHD and we look at some of the challenges people have with ADHD in terms of trying to control impulses, or you know, or some of the organizational aspects of work and not having the support that they should be getting, or even not having the understanding from their employers of what exactly it is that they're facing, that in itself could probably cause a lot of fatigue. So you know, that's one answer I could give on that. The other is the possibility of comorbidities. So a lot of the diagnoses that I typically deal with, they co-occur with other diagnoses quite frequently. So an example of that is, you know, children with ADHD wind up having, you know, about 50% of them wind up having a generalized anxiety disorder. And some of those comorbidities could account for some of the fatigue that is reported. And that's actually like the fatigue that you're talking about, feeling tired. There could be a couple explanations for it. One is some of the theories around executive functioning have suggested that like some of the lower level executive functioning skills would even include like the ability to stay alert throughout the day. But it's not a direct symptom of a diagnosis like ADHD, but fatigue is a symptom of other possible conditions like depression, could be related to anxiety as well. So yeah, that's the best way I can answer that question. But again, like I'm speculating a little bit with some of that. In terms of the other question that was posed to me, in terms of the specific challenges faced by individuals who are neurodivergent, I think rather than discussing specific challenges associated with a whole series of disorders, I think it's probably more useful for everybody to understand that there are commonalities. So I alluded to this before, the idea of executive functioning skills and how important that is to ADHD. Well, the reality is executive functioning impairments exist in every mental health disorder we know of. And so that's probably a good starting point. There are, you know, for employers and to have an understanding of what the executive functions are and how do you support somebody who's got challenges in those areas. That is typically like one of the more underlying challenges that creates impairment for people in the workplace is that specifically. So challenges with, like what I said before, organization, time management, those sorts of things. And one of the big ones is the ability to take a larger task that's got multiple components and to be able to break it down into its constituent parts, and then, you know, try to make sure that all aspects of that are done according to, you know, the expectations and the timelines as well. So that's one of the most important things, I think, for people to understand about some of the challenges faced by neurodivergent employees. But there's other commonalities too. So, and this doesn't mean that anybody who's been diagnosed with something is going to have these challenges, although the executive functioning piece is something that seems to permeate almost every diagnosis. But there are other ones that are very common as well, like working memory deficits and processing speed deficits and difficulties with attention. And so a lot of the time when somebody's having a tough time with attention, we'll often assume that that's ADHD causing it, but it's not necessarily. There can be attention problems for many, many reasons, and that can affect people at work, obviously, for lots of reasons. I'll just go back for a second though to talk about the working memory piece. What that essentially means is it's like your ability to hold information in your mind and work with it, do something with it. So a really good example of that would be mental math. If you can picture yourself doing somebody asking you, what's 26 plus 79, and not allowing you to write that down. So you have to do that in your head. Well, that's an example of a working memory task. And it's an area that's often weaker in individuals who qualify for diagnoses. Processing speed as well. And a lot of these are related. So some researchers will even say that things like working memory deficits are an executive functioning skill. So it's hard to separate all this out, but I think it's really important for employers to know that there are common challenges that neurodivergent individuals are likely to face. And if they understand how to address those and help their employees, you could probably get around a lot of this. Some of the accommodations that can be put in place are really not that challenging to put in place. But the unfortunate thing is that not a lot of people are aware of these challenges.
Thank you so much, Brandon. If I could follow up, Deandra did say that she had a comment about energy that she'd like to build off of your response. So Deandra, feel free to follow up, and thank you, Brandon. I'll be back to you shortly.
Thanks, Ramona. It was interesting when this comment came through. So before I was even diagnosed with ADHD, I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, all of those other labels. They're even saying actually that when someone is diagnosed with fibromyalgia now, they should be screening for ADHD because it's extremely common to struggle with the pain, fatigue side of things and ADHD, especially for women. I don't know why. I'm still explaining that or exploring that myself, but it probably has something to do with masking. Masking, if you're not familiar with it, is the idea that neurodivergent people have to work so hard just to be functional, normal human beings, like especially in the workplace. There's a lot of like self-monitoring that you have to do, like Brendan said, the impulse control, like that kind of stuff. It's nonstop and it's constant. So it is exhausting.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It reminds me of a project that I worked on, which was an NFT that was focused on neurodiversity, and the character, we worked with somebody who identifies as having schizophrenia. The character that we created in this children's book and the NFT had a mask. So thank you for that. I think we won't forget the term masking and the effort and the workload, the burden that accompanies that. So we have lots of questions in the chat, but there are some key moderated content that I'd like to push through as it relates to diagnosis, and then I'll weave in audience questions as well. So Brandon, I'm going to go back to you just so that we can at least have this basis around some of these topics. You talked about unaddressed challenges, but I really wanted to speak or ask you about the overall well-being of neurodivergent employees. Does a diagnosis play a role in improving access to resources and related outcomes? And if it does, what are the common barriers to timely diagnosis? And that can include assessment and diagnosis.
Well, I guess I'll address the first part of that question in terms of how these challenges can impact overall well-being. I think it's a really important piece to take a look at. Most of the prominent theories around well-being and a lot of the research that's been done in this area are centered around three pieces. One is a cognitive appraisal of life satisfaction. And then the other two are the amount of positive affect people experience, and then the amount of negative affect or emotions that people experience. So, probably having your challenges unaddressed, I would suspect is going to have an impact on those last two, the amount of positive and negative emotions that people are experiencing. Obviously struggling in your work environment is going to be associated with some negative emotions. So that's one thing to consider. There's other theories around well-being. One referred to as self-determination theory, And basically, the idea behind this is that your well-being is highly dependent on competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And it's that competence piece that that I think best relates to this. So if you're at work and you're struggling to be able to match the demands of the everyday, you're probably not going to feel incredibly competent, and so obviously that could have an impact on your well-being. There's other theories that suggest that environmental mastery is a key component to well-being as well. And so when we look at environmental mastery, if you're looking at children, that's, are they able to handle the work that they're given at school? Is the programming appropriate? But for adults in the workplace, it's the same. Are they able to master their environment? And that includes their work. And so when challenges are unaddressed, it is likely to have an impact on overall well-being to some degree. In terms of whether a diagnosis can improve access to resources and outcomes, I think it definitely can. There are community agencies that actually require a diagnosis, so that's one piece to the puzzle. But the other side of it is for people to actually have an understanding of what's going on with them, and what are the best ways to address this. And sometimes you have to have an idea of what it is that's causing the challenges before you can decide on a course of action. Some of the common barriers to getting a timely diagnosis, I think most people would be familiar with some of these. I mean, knowing where to go is one. We have lots of people, when we talk about the assessments that we do, it's quite clear that some of the people that we present to, they don't know what those types of assessments are. They've never heard of them before. So they don't understand that they can actually contact a place like the Learning Disabilities Association to have an assessment done. So that's obviously one of the barriers. But then, of course, there's costs associated with it. The assessments we do at LDAS, they're pricey, and there's funding available for adults if they meet specific criteria, but some don't. And some people don't have the insurance to pay for it. So it obviously can be quite pricey, and of course the other side of it is the wait lists. Depending on where you are, we try to keep our wait lists fairly short at LDAS, but I know, and I'm speaking to my own experience working in the school system, there's people are waiting 2 to 3 years to get an assessment done.
Thank you, Brandon. So, we've sort of had this conversation about diagnosis. I see some chat messages related to terminology, so we'll cycle back around to that question. But Christine, I was wondering if you could sort of follow up. Let's assume that you have a diagnosis or some symptoms, and let's talk about disclosure. Many clients, they seek support confidentially, so they may go to you as an ADHD coach. But workplace accommodations often require disclosure. How prevalent is hesitancy to disclose a diagnosis or symptoms of neurodivergence? And how do stigma and professionalism norms contribute?
Important question, and I like to maybe challenge each and every one of our audience today to just think about their own situation in their own workplace currently. I know that we have representation from government, university, nonprofit, education sectors. Right now, as of today, in this moment, would you, if you had this diagnosis, disclose in your workplace? And what would be the factors influencing your decision to disclose or not disclose? Yes, it is something that I hear frequently. It is a personal choice, but we are aware as well that stigma may be similar to many other barriers. It lives on different levels within an organization and our culture and society today. It's institutional, it is systemic, it is interpersonal, it's also internalized. All these levels of ableism do play into it. And when I work with my clients, that is quite often what we explore. To build, I think we spoke a little bit about confidence and then also about acceptance. Frequently when my clients are just first diagnosed, especially as adults, sometimes they know a lot about ADHD already, sometimes they don't. Sometimes the only frame of reference they have is that they were in school. I'm going to use language that's unpleasant, but they were in school and the ADHD kids were the rubber room kids. And so that is very much plays in how they perceive themselves as well. And that will be a journey that we undertake in coaching.
Excellent, thank you. So we have a lot of audience questions. I'm going to ask just a few more of the moderated, and I think we're going to just move to almost exclusively audience questions, because I think it's important to take into consideration the needs of the public and those who are joining us. So questions are more representative, not just from me. So I do want to, go to Greg and Alberto, although we will cycle back to Deandra, because I do think it's important that we also look at autism specifically. Particularly as we're looking at some of the terminology questions. There are a few questions regarding policy here. What are the key policy considerations and potential gaps in existing policy frameworks, accessibility legislation, and how does this affect the public sector's ability to support and promote inclusivity for employees?
I can take that one, Ramona, and it's a great question. And again, we talked about the Saskatchewan Accessibility Act passed last year. That's a great policy that we have in our favor. The focus on removing barriers is a great place to start or to continue our work towards inclusion of neurodiverse individuals. Of course, it's new, right? We're only working on our first plan. The federal legislation passed very recently too, just a couple of years before. They've only had one full year of implementation. There's a lot of learning that we have to do still in government to do the implementation of these plans, right? But it's exciting times, I think, because they do allow for a great opportunity. Now, when talking about gaps, I think what happens here, or some of the issues that we may find, is that our current policies do not capture the diversity within the neurodivergent community, right? So it's difficult to find all of the required support. I think there's a need on ongoing education and training to increase awareness and understanding of what neurodiversity is. And I would say that the inclusion of neurodiverse employees is in its infancy. It's silent, right? Deandra mentioned partnerships with highways, which are amazing. I love those programs. They're a great way to start to open the road for other individuals to find employment, meaningful employment within government. But it's siloed, it's here and there, ministries here and there that are very passionate, very supportive, and that's, I think, right now the source of most opportunities for these employees. But what happens is that we don't have reliable data, as I mentioned, because there is no employment equity legislation that includes neurodiversity. We don't measure how many neurodiverse individuals we have. To prepare for this panel, we actually did an interjurisdictional scan. We reached out to all service commissions across government, provincial and federal, and we found the same thing. Nobody measures how many neurodiverse employees they already have in their workforce, except for PEI, which they do during their employee engagement surveys, right? So that's a great start, I think. Also, in researching for these, I learned that the federal government in Australia actually includes neurodiversity in their self-declaration campaigns. They started recently, and what they found is that 8% of their employees self-declare as neurodivergent, and 12% said that they weren't sure if they were neurodivergent. So I would say that the data is very important. What you measure is what gets done. I think I learned that at JSGS. So I think that's a very good place to start, or I would suggest that may be a good place to start, actually knowing how much of what we have already in our workforce, right? Deandra mentioned self-diagnosis is a problem, also Brandon. So that may be key, but I know I've had lots of conversations with employees in my current role and in previous roles where people were telling me self-disclosing, and it was very interesting, right? So these conversations are great to continue to work towards that. I hope that helps with this question.
Absolutely, thank you. Could you just elaborate? Carrie Ann did ask a question in particular as it relates to the Accessibility Act, and its effect on the current state of education in Saskatchewan. Could you just sort of elaborate a little bit further on that as we're talking about the Accessibility Act?
That's a very good question. I'm not totally familiar with the act because that's not part of what our team does actually.
Excellent. So this may be a thesis topic for some of you MPP students who are here. Let's look at that. Okay, great. So I have another question, and I think I'll direct this one to Greg, if you don't mind. You mentioned that you had this interjurisdictional scan to understand the public sector. Are there any other findings that you wanted to sort of speak to? What was the process? Are there any plans now for action based on that interjurisdictional scan that was mentioned by Alberto?
No problem. Yeah. So interjurisdictional scan, we do those quite regularly for understanding, where does Saskatchewan fall within the greater Canadian public sectors. We communicate with other jurisdictions, other provinces, and the federal government to understand, with their public service commissions, to understand, questions around certain things. So in preparation for this discussion, we're trying to understand what exists out there and compare it to what we do now. And we found that Saskatchewan is actually very in line with what everyone else is doing right now. As Alberto had already mentioned, other than PEI, there is no other jurisdiction that actually measure neurodiverse individuals within their equity groups. We found that most respondents had indicated that typically the neurodiverse individuals are grouped together with persons with a disability, because that's the way that it sort of functions for providing things like such as accommodations and for tracking within our, for strategies and policies and things like that. So yeah, so there really isn't a lot of work that's being done within the country in terms of what they responded to. In terms of actions forward, we are sort of limited to what we're instructed to do from a legislation standpoint. We can't introduce new equity groups. However, us in Saskatchewan here, in the chat, I think one of our PSE colleagues there mentioned the Be at Work program. That is an accommodation program that we have for the public sector. And I encourage you, if you can look more information on Saskatchewan.ca for that to find out how that works. And that is the function that we would use to accommodate neurodiverse individuals to have a more improved workspace. It does fall within that medical accommodation sort of framework. So for a lot of the more specific stuff, you may have to have a diagnosis of some sort, at least for, as was mentioned, understanding what the restrictions are. But I would mention that, for the most part, I'm going to jump ahead to one of your later questions there, Ramona. The way to move forward for a lot of this, getting that accommodation in place, there's a lot of stuff that a manager can do, a people leader can do to assist their employees. And I've done lots of learning and instructing on leadership and managerial stuff with my time in the military. And that's one of those things that you focus a lot on, is ensuring that your people are enabled to complete the mission, complete their work, and do that successfully. So there's a lot of low to no cost options that are available to managers that they can implement to support their employees. So it doesn't matter whether they declare that they have neurodiversity. They need to adjust their time in the day. They need to start a bit later because they have a hard time starting in the morning. They need breaks at certain times of the day because they have specific needs that they must adjust to. When we look at things from our perspective, from the EDI, our EDI unit, we look at diversity and accommodation, and that feeling of belonging and inclusion as a whole. So a lot of these, a lot of the methods that we encourage when it comes to managerial support for employees is, what can we do to make sure that someone feels like they belong in that workplace? That's it could be physically, it could be emotionally, it could be those extra supports. Maybe they need extra check-ins, they need guidance on task management. Understanding that some people just think about and approach work differently. So we always encourage, that's one of the things that we encourage a lot of. And those are the very, like I said, little to no cost accommodation measures that don't require a larger program. a lot of persons with disabilities, they do self-manage, and those people, same thing with people who are neurodiverse. I have a couple nieces that are autistic, and they manage themselves for the most part. They don't go in and access additional services most of the time because they figured out how to function within the world that they live in. But then when they do encounter a barrier that they cannot overcome, they are not afraid to ask for those supports. So I would say that one of the big things there is to be open and try to, for managers, be open and create a safe space. So that way your employees feel comfortable enough to come speak with you about those extra needs that they might have, because there's a lot we can do without having to formalize a process.
Excellent. Thank you for that comprehensive response. So again, there's so much content here that we could touch on today. But I did notice a comment from Claudia, and it sort of dovetails nicely from the question that I have. So I'm going to merge those questions. Diverse perspectives on neurodivergence are shaping workplace practices. And this question, it's open to anyone, certainly Brandon as well, if you'd like to speak to this. While the medical disability model, which is really focused on accommodations, and the social model, maybe looking more at dismantling barriers, offer valuable insights, can you elaborate on specific aspects from these two models and potentially others? So Claudia mentions the disability justice model, that when implemented together hold the most promise for neurodiversity in the workplace. So really considering these different perspectives. And we know that there's a lot of social movements and a lot of advocacy from those with lived experiences that are shaping some of the way that we look at these models of neurodivergence. So I'll start with Brandon, but if anybody would like to follow up, certainly Deandra, I'd love to also hear from you. Feel free to do so.
Yeah, so when we were talking about the medical model, I think, we're talking about a focus on deficits and impairments and the treatments to try to help to alleviate some of those impairments. Whereas, in the social model, we're looking at the idea that impairments are the result of, an interaction between what the individual is experiencing and the barriers that are created by our society, by our societal norms. And the focus there would be on removing barriers. The way I see it, like a blend of those models is probably most helpful for neurodivergent individuals. Some of the work that Christine does with her clients is around the idea of skill building and trying to put structures and routines in place to address some of the challenges that people with ADHD commonly encounter. But the reality is, if we look at any of the research around behavior management, and I mean most of that, like I'm familiar with the research that's been done with children, a lot of that research suggests that it's the environment that needs to change, and that it's naive to think you're going to fix the child who's engaging in the challenging behaviors. And my experience working in the school system, I used to oversee as mentioned before, intensive needs programming, but some of that programming was alternative education classrooms for children who were struggling in the mainstream classrooms, and so they were often transferred into other classrooms. And part of the problem with that model in the education system is this idea that we're going to send you somewhere to get fixed. But the reality is, a lot of the time, it's actually the system where the problem lies. And I think, yes, it's important to try to build the skills in the individual who's experiencing some of those challenges. But at the same time, there's a lot of things that can be done in the environment to address some of this as well. And when the environment is addressed appropriately, a lot of those challenges seem to be alleviated. And it's a lot easier doing that than it is to actually try to address the impairments in the individual themselves and try to fix that.
Excellent, thank you. I appreciate that. Deandra, I'd like to focus a little bit on autism spectrum disorder. So did you want to first sort of build off of what Brandon has said specifically for autism populations? And then I have a follow-up question for you.
Sure, yeah. I actually have a little visual I just want to share. Can you see it? Oh, there. So yeah, the medical model and the social model are things that were coming up in the comments. I wanted to address it at the start, but didn't have time. So the medical model, yeah, a lot of the language around it is like deficit, impairment, disorder, those kinds of words, which like as a neurodivergent person here, hearing those words kind of is a little harmful because it's just like neurodiversity is just it's just how brains are different. And then like, it's not bad, it's not good, it's just neutral. It's just, that's a fact that neurodiversity exists and lots of brains are different, and that's a good thing. So here at ARC, we actually operate more from the social model. So with previous autism treatments, it was all really, yeah, behavior-based, trying to change the child to act more normal, essentially, was the goal. And a lot of autistic adults now who went through that as kids are coming out and talking about how awful it was and how harmful it was to go through that. So here at ARC, we've intentionally shifted to more of the social model where we just accept them as they are. We'll give them the supports that they want to have. It's all voluntary, because there are those common areas that we struggle with, like, yeah, executive functioning, interview skills, those kinds of things. We can give that support, yeah, when it's needed. So.
Excellent, thank you. I appreciate that. So there was a question that's specific to autism in the chat, and I from a policy perspective, I think it is important for us to look at this. In 2023, Canada, and this is from iPhone, so it's anonymous. Canada unanimously passed an act to create a framework for autism spectrum disorder to span supports for an individual with ASD lifetime, as well as their caregivers and service providers, including discussion on diagnosis. Federal consultations are underway relating to this national autism strategy. Deandra, did you have anything to speak to that? And I'll follow up with Greg or Alberto if they have encountered this policy as well, the strategy.
Yeah, I think there was another comment in here too. We had, I'm so sorry, I forget her name. We had her come and speak at our annual general meeting last year to talk about this framework. Yeah, I think there's still like a lot of work to be done, but at least something is happening. Also, I just want to mention something that was also in the chat relating to autism. So there's a big debate in the autism community around like identity first and person first language. So identity first language is like autistic person, like, or I am autistic, versus the person first language, which is like a person with autism. It's different in different like disability communities, but predominantly in the autism community, they prefer identity first. So yeah, that's why I've been saying autistic person, things like that.
Excellent. So do you have any insights about that specific strategy, or do you feel that a strategy is needed at this time?
Yeah, so I'll be honest, I don't have a ton of like new information to share about it. It's all like, yeah, we posted the discussion on our website, so you can check it out there. I think someone put a link in the comments here as well. It's just, yeah, it's definitely needed. That's for sure.
Excellent, thank you. Greg, Greg, could you follow up to that, or have you considered this in your interjurisdictional scan, sort of how this strategy might influence accessibility policy in the future, for example?
So we actually don't have any engagement and interaction with this strategy at this time. It's not specific to public sector organizations or employers, and more for resources for the autism community. But so we haven't really engaged with it too much. So I don't have a lot to add for this.
I do have a question about terminology, maybe because I'm an information management professional, so terminologies are important, and it also came up in the chat. I'm thinking that Christine, would you be interested to sort of speaking to different terminologies? We talked about person first. For example, are there any other sort of, sometimes there's a lot of conflation of the different terms, like difference between neurodivergence, neurodiversity, neuronormativity, neurominority. There's so many different terms. And they come from, again, a lot of these different spheres of influence, whether that's medical disability or social justice. Did you want to speak to that?
Not in any way to give any definitive answer to this is what we should use, this is what we should not use. I think there's so much expertise on this already that I've seen in the chat and that Deandra has spoken to as well. I just want to emphasize again that this is whatever we use as terminology for ourselves, what we are comfortable with, to remember that we are talking about a world that is laying that on us, as the differences exist, as has been pointed out before as well, because others create the us and them for us. And I know this is diverging, and hey, I'm going to call on my right as an ADHDer to do that. When we talk about managers and employers, when we talk about the workplace and employees, and this is dear to my heart, we seem to put the employer automatically into the neurotypical group. And then the employee is the neurodivergent person who might want to disclose or not disclose. I just want to emphasize there is no difference. It's across all layers and across all sectors. I hope that I'm making that point clear enough.
Excellent, thank you. I really do appreciate that. There were some situational questions, Amanda and Renee. So I thought I would pose these to Greg and Alberto. So one relates to this person's experience joining question period at the legislative building. It's a required tour of new public servant employees, and they were dealing with feeling maybe lethargic, falling asleep. There's noise, there's lights. How might you address similar situations in the future in the work that you're doing in the public sector? So attending question period at a legislative building, for example.
So I'm not familiar with that person's experience, but like doing the tours of legislature, but it isn't necessary. It's not mandatory for everyone. I'm sure as part of the ledge employment, it likely is. But I think it comes back to what I had said earlier about being open with your people leaders, right? Like the people who are you're responsible to and who are responsible for you. If you are someone who typically has a harder time functioning at certain times of day, you get lethargic, identifying that and being open and honest with yourself about what kind of needs you have. Your manager, your employer can only do so much if they're aware. But if you are unable to tell someone that you need help, it's hard for us to provide support for that. So I would say that in terms of that, and from a manager perspective, I would suggest that be open and understanding to that others may have certain needs that are different than your own. And I want to thank Christine for mentioning that a manager may not be neurotypical either. That leads more into the broader spectrum of diversity that we work with in our area, is that we always tend to look for at what we're experience has been for someone in those roles. So when someone mentions a CEO or a chair or a president, we typically think of a white male, because that's what we see in those roles typically throughout history. So we see charismatic leaders and managers. We see employers led by extroverted white males throughout history. So that's what we were typically going to expect there. But there's a lot more compassion nowadays than there was, in the past. There's a lot more diversity in leadership. There's a lot more diversity in employers. So I would say that there is a bit more availability for the employers to have those conversations with their managers in advance, so that way that the manager can step up and advocate for them, because those managers may have gone through a similar experience and can provide some supports from those lived experiences as well.
Excellent. Thank you. So, we've had quite a extensive conversation here today, and I sort of wanted to speak about that communication, as you just mentioned. So, Christine, how can organizations proactively support employees who identify as neurodivergent in communicating their needs and navigating the accommodation process? This is not to suggest that the burden is just on them, but the communication is going to be critical to that. So I'm thinking about the supports that, for example, you might provide in your coaching that would help in that communication and sort of engaging in that dialogue.
Engaging in the dialogue, I think, is the key there. An organization like ELDA certainly has expertise available that can provide support for employers as well. So yeah, definitely, first of all, one-on-one conversations, but take it further as well, have facilitated workshops. And then following that as well, make sure the ball doesn't get dropped, and follow that up with ongoing expert support as you take this further. Currently, my coaching extends to my clients, and we do deal with the barriers in the workplace. I would love to be able to extend that to their direct supervisor, to whatever unit they are in, and let's have this conversation together. We are unfortunately still at a point, as you had said, Craig, where the onus is on the person who has the lived experience to take that step. It would be wonderful if that were not the case, but yeah, to reach out for help. And I'm just thinking, such a simple little thing, because you're talking about it doesn't have to cost anything, right? It's such a simple little thing that ELDA is just for me. And hey, when you write an email to your client, here are some conversation starters. If the email is about this and this and that, it's simple. If a thing like we all follow email protocols for etiquette, right? You do the email sandwiching, right? Hey, how is everybody? I hope you had a good weekend. And then comes the important part of the message, and then, hey, and I hope everybody had a chance to see the Northern Lights on the weekend. For me, I would agonize for hours about do I or do I not answer the question about the Northern Lights, right? Hey, please highlight the portion you want me to answer. That might be helpful. Ongoing conversation, that's the key.
Excellent, thank you. So we're almost close to finishing. So I really wanted to end on sort of a strength-based perspective. I'm gonna go to Deandra, and then I'll go to Greg and Alberto to sort of finish us off as it relates to the public sector. But Deandra, many resources and supports, they focus on children with autism. However, a lot of the work that you do supports adults, including professionals within their employment, and specifically today we're talking about the knowledge sector and in the public sector, the knowledge sector within that. Compared to the general adult working population, how does the work, how do the work needs of professionals with autism differ? And I really want to add this point here, because we had a lot of questions. Could you also speak to those unique strengths that those adults, who have autism might be able to bring to their work?
Sure. Thanks, Ramona. You actually did what I was going to do and talk about some of the needs, but also focus on the strengths too, because so often we're only talking about the negative things about neurodivergent people when there's actually a lot of strengths. So you're right, there is only often only support for autistic children. I think that maybe people think that people just grow out of autism, which you definitely don't. It's a lifelong condition. So I just shared a resource in the chat under one of the threads here about autism acceptance in the workplace. Here, I'll just post it to everyone. So these are just some ideas of what you can do to make the workplace more accessible for the neurodivergent employees. And these things work on some of the struggles that we might have, like executive functioning. By the way, executive functioning is required in every aspect to be a good employee. Things like working memory, organizing, prioritizing, things like that are really important to be a good employee, but it's something that we have to work really hard on. So having support with that is appreciated. There's also some like interpersonal or communication differences between neurodivergent and neurotypical people. There's also lots of sensory needs that neurodivergent people are going to have. And the typical workplace can be really overstimulating. There's bright fluorescent lights, there's like overlapping chatter that you're hearing. Yeah, busy workspaces, it's very distracting and overstimulating. So having support with that is important. And also just considering the whole masking thing that we talked about before, that peopling all day can be really exhausting for neurodivergent people. So yeah, just to keep that in mind. And when workplaces are neuro-inclusive, they get to benefit from having awesome employees. And I have yet another visual, I'm very visual, to show some of the strengths that we often see with autistic employees. So here in the center is the autistic skills, and then it branches out into like 4 different areas. So cognitive advantages like attention to detail, pattern recognition. There's efficiency. They're also often very productive, very organized. There's also strengths related to their personal qualities. So strong sense of social justice, increased empathy. Then there's also a unique autism-specific perspective that they bring. Sometimes they really enjoy tasks that neurotypical people dislike, or they have special interests and they're very motivated and excited to do the thing that they're doing. But keep in mind that there's this saying for a reason. If you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Not everything is going to apply to every autistic person that you meet. For example, if an autistic person also has ADHD, quite a few of these might not even apply. There's like strong contradictions that happen between the autism and ADHD sometimes. Yeah, I hope that answered the question. I went off on a bit of a tangent.
No, that was a wonderful tangent. So perhaps we could follow up, thinking about these strengths in the public sector. So again, Greg or Alberto, or both, you're welcome to answer as our sort of last question. We know, for example, in the US, the military is actively hiring people who are neurodivergent for some of these skills that were highlighted by Deandra, right? So have you thought about some of those skills in the context of, public service delivery and, potentially fostering workplace innovation or other potential benefits that, having a neurodiverse workforce could potentially contribute to and sort of improve the work that you're doing?
I can take this one, and you bring a great example there, Ramona. I know during our prep conversation, we talked about it. National security in the U.S. They have a team that's neurodiverse, and they have been able to detect many threats. Right? Most of you read about the hacking attempts in BC. These are some of the things that these groups are working on, and that's because of those unique skills that Diana was mentioning. So that's just a great example, and I want to share a couple more for those that like numbers. Before that, I know that in Canada it was recommended that we implemented something like that at the federal level. I don't know where that's at, but I think it's a great program to have. But another example, and they come from the private sector, SAP. It's an international software technology company that has an Autism at Work initiative. And again, those who like numbers, 30% productivity boost, a significant 40 million cost saving from a technical solution that these teams identify. These teams have changed the work culture at SAP, because everybody wants to participate. And I'm not talking about neurodiverse individuals wanting to participate. I'm talking about everybody, right? Because they want to be part of this. They enjoy it. They learn. It's just a great program. What I like the most about this program is that it started as a weekend program in Bangalore, India, where a couple of hours they were trying to just find employment for these kids with or these young adults with autism, and it turned into a huge international program. The last I read was by 2022, I believe. So they're old, but still they had a target of hiring 650 individuals with autism, right? Which I think it's huge. Now, what I say all of this, it's because, again, I mentioned that in the public sector right now, I feel we're in our infancy, where we're having these programs here and there. The weekend program from Bangalore, basically, that then gets this potential to explode and to reach every areas. What happened again with SAP, they started with IT, and they started testing with marketing. They started testing with legal compliance. They started testing with all of these other areas that they had no idea that this could benefit them. And it did, all across the company, right? So same thing here. In government, we're starting with silo programs in highways, in other ministries, right? At corporations. But how can we take these opportunities or these learnings that we have and push it up to a different level, right? And I don't have the answer. I wish I did it, but it's part of what our team, I'm sure it's going to be working in the next few years.
Excellent. Thank you for finishing us off, Alberta, with those great examples. I do believe that we've sort of exhausted our time, but not the questions or not the interest. So I certainly hope, Karen, that in the future there could be a follow-up. The questions that we were unable to get to, maybe that can build a future discussion. And we have a new faculty member who'll be joining us whose research focuses on disability. So maybe I'll have a conversation with him and see how he would approach this topic. So certainly something that we'll hold on to and reflect on. So like I mentioned, we're at the end of our time together. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank today's speakers. Again, Greg Linsmeyer, Brandon Newton, Deandra Nicholson, Alberta Ortez Rosilio, and Christine Vandermeer. Thank you again. Excellent. Thank you for your insight and observations on how workplace can be more inclusive. So thank you everyone for joining us today. As I mentioned, the session will be recorded. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to Karen and she can provide that additional information. So have yourselves a great rest of your day. Take care now.